Thanks, Chair. I just want to put on record my utter frustration and disappointment that only during lunchtime we got an email from the committee that the majority of the amendments that I submitted along with Deputy Funchion and Ward were ruled out of order because they have financial implication under Standing Order 212, and in effect that means that the substantial changes which have been discussed in this committee and in pre-legislative scrutiny and in the early stages of the bill will never be examined, and the amendments ruled out of order can only now be discussed in relation to Deputy Sherlock's amendment on the need for a report, and they include ensuring that people who are boarded out as children, which is approximately 5,000 people, would have been included in the scheme, adding people who are part of the illegal medical trials to the scheme, removing the arbitrary and discriminatory exclusion of people who spent less than 6 months in homes as children, giving recognition for systematic racism, and the removal of the requirement for survivors to sign a legal waiver. I think it's important that we note this for the people watching and for those that it impacts. The standing orders have done an incredible disservice to survivors and the Irish people today. In reality, the Minister would have disregarded most or all of those amendments, but at least they would have been discussed, and at least survivors would have heard their words and their points that they raised in the Oak report being at least considered. Committee stage is supposed to be a chance to properly interrogate ideas into formally and non-formally influenced legislation, and the only thing we can do now is ask the Minister that he'd include a report to look at those things. Or, Minister, we could ask you to have a look at the amendments that were ruled out of order and potentially introduce them yourself, because even at this stage we've discussed this legislation through private members' business and other things. I did actually wonder how would you, throughout the process, this stage, the next stage, defend something like children who spent less than 6 months in an institution can't get redress, and I suppose now I see how we won't be able to discuss it. I'm not saying that's you, that's the standing order, but in the interest of everybody watching and everything, I think it would be good to explain why people who spent less than 6 months in an institution can't get redress. And I think people don't want to hear that you think the birth information and tracing legislation is redress enough for those people, because we know that it's not. It's a shame that we can't discuss it throughout the amendments in the bill, but I think people would like an explanation to that, a proper one. So just in relation to the need for review after 6 months, and I know you were saying there that you think it's too soon because there isn't time for it to kind of flesh out and see how the legislation is working. And I suppose the point I think that we're all trying to make is that we don't need 6 months to know that the legislation is unsuitable and outrageous, in that it excludes people, for example, who spent less than 6 months in an institution, and our opportunity to debate amendments like that isn't available to us because the amendments have been ruled out of order. So our only way of hoping that those changes might be made at this point is hoping that a review is done as soon as possible, and any later than that isn't good enough. We know, the point I'm trying to make, I think, is just we don't need any time to know that this legislation is not okay. Experts in human rights, your own department's report, the Oak report, survivors themselves, psychologists who are experts in early years have all said that the legislation is not suitable. So 6 months is too long, I think, as far as we're concerned, and I just really hope that you would just reconsider and maybe include this amendment.
In terms of the request that we review section 13.1 and section 13.2 and the timeline set out there, I suppose I make the point, and I know deputies may not agree with this point, and that's obviously legitimate, but this scheme and the institutional payment scheme is one part of the state's response to what happened in these institutions. And we have the 22 actions set out in the action plan. They encompass a range of responses, recognising that the priorities of survivors are multifaceted, and Deputy Funchion spoke with great passion there about an issue in terms of the need to find a family relative. Those issues are what we are seeking to address in terms of the information and tracing legislation, and address the huge need of people to understand their own identity and make provision and make an allowance for the possibility of families being united through a statutory tracing service, which we've introduced. We're bringing forward the institutional burials legislation in response initially to the situation in Tuam. We're providing for commemoration, we're providing for education, we're providing for a children's fund, we're providing for a range of health supports, the enhanced medical card provided for in this legislation, but also looking at patient liaison, patient advocacy liaison, ones, linking the Tilda health study into former residents of mother and baby in county home institutions to understand the long-term health implications. So this element is one part of that overall response to those who are in mother and baby and county home institutions, both as children and also as adults.
Yeah, I suppose just because it is our only opportunity to discuss these aspects of the redress scheme now, I suppose just there you were saying it again, Minister, that, oh, well, this isn't the only part of a response to survivors, that there's the birth information tracing legislation, etc., etc. But like realistically, you know and I know and everybody watching knows that that's not redress. You know, birth information and tracing legislation is allowing people to access information that they should have been able to access all along. It's not a redress scheme. You know, it's a separate piece of legislation for a reason, because it's not redress. Could you please outline why people who spent less than 6 months in this institution are being excluded without referring to other legislation, which we all know is not redress?
Well, I don't agree with you there. I believe that the range of measures that we're putting forward in the action plan do constitute redress. I think the measures we're talking about in this piece of legislation here constitute a financial payment in terms of redress, but in terms of accessing information, in terms of literally seeking to deal with the really fundamental issues and the different fundamental issues that survivors have identified over the years, I think that is redress. I think it represents part of the state making up for the multifaceted failures that have been demonstrated
could you just outline why people who spent less than 6 months in an institution don't get a payment?
By
point.
These institutions.
Just the 1 point, Minister, why, if you spent less than 6 months in an institution, do you not get a payment?
In terms of in terms of the format for this particular scheme, as you know, we made a decision early on to base it on time spent in an institution.
Why?
Because we didn't want to go for an adversarial system that had existed in that have been used in schemes.
Why 6 months?
Schemes used in Ireland and schemes used in other countries. And indeed, I'd point to the fact that more adversarial schemes that relied on the provision of evidence.
Could you outline where the 6 months came from? It's not an answer.
In terms of addressing schemes that relied on evidence being brought forward, those sort of schemes have actually been replaced. The Stolen Generation scheme in Australia originally used an evidence-based approach, and it then moved to a time-based approach to talking about a common experience. So we believe a time-based approach is the right one to go in terms of recognising the impact on individuals of time spent in these institutions. And that's the basis of the approach that we're taking.